Hi all, Randy Green here, and welcome to the September monthly membership podcast. Oh, that was difficult to say. You have most likely listened to the public update, which is very similar to what I normally put here in the membership version of YouTube. But I want to go differently this time because there are so many people out there who kind of need to hear some things I have to say. I'm not saying, I'm super important, so I've got so much to say. But there are experiences I've had, and I am willing and eager to share them to the best way I can. Also because we have crossed a threshold where a lot of things I learned the last 10 years, the last 9-year cycle of the 3-9 pillar, were just on the possibility stage. And in that, I didn't want, in the beginning, I shared, and a lot of people, I have the same experiences. And then we amplified. I'm not saying we are to blame or anything. It's just this very narrow path of what to amplify and what not to amplify. In the 3-9 pillar, we were technically playing out principle 1, 2, and 3, as in principle 1, the first of many for the highest good of many. That is, we are discovering this, we are unfolding this, we are experiencing this, and we're sharing this. So it becomes part of the everyday awareness of the collective. So that's where the individual timelines and relative realities braid and merge into the collective timeline, where our personal experiences then become part of the joint collective, and in that way are existing or assisting the joint collective to progress and be uplifted. It can also be used for the opposite, which we are seeing on a daily basis with our reality field, and that's why it is in the state that it is in now and has gone under the resetting dynamics due to the depletion of it, because you can either elevate or you can de-elevate. You can deconstruct and go into entropy and chaos and then cease to exist altogether. So these are the laws of the universal structures which we're seeing all around us, turning into dust or turning into new stars. Okay. Then we also learn to navigate into, so principle 1 is technically the complete administration of our own holographic energetic template, and that's the key principle of pillar 1-7. And for those of you who are, what is she talking about? You can do the transition sciences on the free HAL Academy, which you find on tuvai.dk. And then there is the template sciences, where I explain all of this in detail. So you get all of the intrinsic details of what that actually means. So I'm just doing a quick sum up here. Then there was principle 2, and that's the balance principle, as in the understanding of transformation of energy. So it reaches its balance point. Just to use another teacher who used the same understanding, the Buddha, the middle path, you have the extremes, and you are putting into the center point where you understand that things go between, or you have Hegel, Friedrich Hegel, who said that you have the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis. So this is the psyche as processes, and the balance point where you either turn it to the balance point, and from there you elevate it and you can transform, or it goes into dustification. And that's the individual dynamics, but it's also part of the 2-8 pillar, where whatever is activated now has its last chance to activate and be transformed and lifted up to its highest potentials, becoming a synergy with, if it's within the cycle 4, then it is the opposition dynamics, as you were taught in the first 3 courses of the transition sciences, where you are working with who you are, and then the otherness as the opposition, not because we are opposed to each other, but because we have 2 different types of energy vibrational states, which then either resonates or de-resonates, as in either they create a positive interference patterns that lift us both, or they create an interference patterns that creates deconstructive wave patterns. This is where I use science and frequency science to understand these dynamics. But we are frequency-based beings, so the high order level of this awareness both goes with consciousness, but it also goes with the current type of vessels that we have, that our type of consciousness is embedded into this type of vessels that has these different vibrational and radiation patterns that we call frequency spectrum within the electrochemical processes of the emotional field and the electrochemical processes of the mental field that we can call two different forms of wave patterns that are interacting with each other, either creating synergy that lives both or creates the opposite that then becomes deconstructive for both and leads to a lesser positive version of who and what we are. And then, of course, we have to segregate and acknowledge that our fields are not compatible. They are too dissimilar, so the transformation cannot happen. Or to acknowledge the fact that one is further ahead than the other, and in that way the transformation is not possible either, because then the one becomes the main transformer in the field dynamics, and the other one becomes the receiver, and that becomes complacent and is not doing what is supposed to be done. And we're seeing that playing out quite a lot around us, where this field opposition, interference, elevation dynamics then turn into the opposite, unfortunately. And then principle 3, that is part of the 3-9 pillar, where the law of participation. So this is where I come in and say, under these 3 principles, including principle 4, which is the law of reciprocity, and principle 5, which is the true inner knowledge, you know this, and principle 6, which is what we call correct partnerships, where we elevate it all into a kind of an extraordinary understanding of that goes with wisdom. But I don't want to go there now, because that's part of pillar 612 that is super advanced on 7 different dimensions of radiation and vibrational levels that goes with the highest level of our template structure that we can gain inside this reality field, or supposedly used to, not anymore. That was taken away from us during the colonization. So the 612 pillar is not in a good state. The reality dynamics, the timelines that are there are highly littered with things that are tying into some very unfortunate past reality field settings that those who get there, they get into trouble. The reason why this becomes important is because some of the seals that are in people who are under the 2-8 pillar that didn't complete their activation cycles back in the days when the 2-8 pillar was in operation, and when we got colonized 15,000 years ago, some of these dark timelines that are connected to the 612 pillar are the ones that foundation of the seals of the imprisonment templates. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this podcast here for the membership. So you get a little bit deeper insight. And for many of you, this is sciences where you kind of say, where does that come from? And I'm just saying that I've had it all along, but how am I explaining this when I'm still struggling to figure out what it was? When I was learning this, I was immersed into it. So it's difficult to observe and teach and come out with some proper information while you're in the midst of a rabbit hole of being thrown balls at you all the time. So you wait until it's no longer just a possibility, but has come to that state where the main timeline has the clear indications, no longer possibilities. The collective has chosen to go down the path they're going. The new grand cycle activation and cleanup cycles was only activated by few, and that means the viability rate got even less the last 9 years. Since 2012, actually, it's just gone downhill. And in that way, the collective is determining and deciding by their everyday living and actions and choices and what they're doing, the future that we're getting into. And that's right back into the AI-driven oversight realities, which we already done before, that kind of deconstruct our entire solar system to begin with, and was part of what led to their colonization. Okay, so point being is that the seals that are there in their imprisonment templates, and here let me explain a little bit what I know of the imprisonment templates. I learned about them when I was in Australia because we don't have many of them in Denmark. In Denmark, the majority that's here is what we call enslavement templates. What is enslavement templates? Let's begin there. That's a little bit more light. They don't have the same type of seals. The seals that are in our template. And here I'm asking of you to reread Understanding the Old Stellar Souls, because that's where I describe this. So I'm going a little bit back here. And for many of you that are saying, oh, I don't know how to get it, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it plenty of places. Just look on the internet. There are a lot of people who are offering my books as paperbacks or just as Kindle versions out there in different providers and retailers. It doesn't have to be on Amazon if you're living around the world where that isn't implemented yet. But point being, so I learned about that when I was in Australia, and that's 2017-18. So I was in the middle of it, experiencing it with people around me down there, and I had to go there to find these templates because they are not prominent in Denmark. So back to the enslavement template in Denmark, which means that when we were colonized, the original solar system civilization, I'm saying we because I am one of them, and yes, I have an enslavement template, so that's why I'm here. We were colonized 15,000 years ago when the D10 collective decided to take over reality field. I have described that in the book, The Souls of Humanity, which is 10 years ago I wrote that book. And today, yes, I know from, as I said, the other public update, I would probably describe it differently. But that's the knowledge I had at the time. So now I'm giving you the knowledge I have now. So point being, the prohibiting technologies that were part of the colonization that happened 15,000 years ago overrode the original reality field cube technology that upholds this construct that is artificial as part of the Regenesis programs. This construct was built by the original solar system civilizations as a Regenesis hub for multiple species within our solar system to assist and help them to undergo what we call regeneration of the Regenesis programs that were tied into the regressive DNA and the regressive consciousness units, as well as the effects we had from the timeline event that were hitting most of what we call the fifth cycle civilizations. So the regression dynamics mostly happen within the fourth cycle civilizations, whereas the inversion happened within the fifth cycle civilizations due to the different systemic configurations of civilizations. And we're here talking fifth cycle similar to fifth dimension, fourth cycle similar to fourth dimension. And then because of these Regenesis programs, different kinds of pocket realities were created in the outskirts of the original reality field, which you see in the book, The Souls of Humanity. And from there were created different zones where Regenesis would happen, all depending on if it was in the fourth cycle or the fifth cycle. These were the first programs that were separate, put it that way. The fifth cycle programs were put under the 511, where a lot of technology and AI were used. The cubes that were re-engineered there were the Syrian cubes, and that's why it's part of the transformative energy system, as the mental field as things are now. Whereas the fourth cycle Pleiadian Syrian A programs were put into the vibrational field, which is part of the fourth cycle. So the fourth cycle was to complete within the understanding of the vibrational field, and that means the self-other dynamic, how the two really work with principle 1 and 2. Whereas the fifth cycle civilizations were both to work with principle 1, 2, 3, 4, and of course 5. And yes, cycle 4 also includes principle 3 and principle 4, of course, as you know, because that's part of the cycles where we'll learn these dynamics through the different pillars in different variations and different complex scenarios, of which the majority of them were driven by advanced technology that simulates realities. It's not virtual reality, don't be mistaken, but it is driven by an augmented type of cube technology that the best way we can understand it is AI. That's why I'm just using that. But it's not AI as we know of it. It's consciousness infused driven cube technology that has an imprint pattern that is similar to the different reality fields and consciousness fields it's administered. And I know it's super sciencey and I can't explain it less because this is the advanced sciences you need to understand if you truly are to clean out the mental field and the emotional field of your current constitution. So these separate programs in the outer domain then existed side by side. The fifth dimensional was what called the Atlantean project, and the fourth cycle is more or less what we understand as the base level of this reality field. Then we had the big event in the fifth planet in our solar system that imploded, and then the whole fifth cycle dynamics were no longer possible to keep inside our reality. So with that reality field dynamic that lost its fifth cycle own planetary system or reality field dynamics, at the time we didn't have planets as we have now, we then had to create an artificial reality. That's the artificial fifth that were created because of that and was built strictly on cube technology from the Sirian system. The problem was that the Sirian system itself was already undergoing stark inversion on the fifth cycle levels, the polarity level, where it could no longer ping as a polarity to transform and elevate into the sixth, which is some very specific dynamics that I touched ground with in the reconfiguration sciences, as well as in some of the levels of the meditation course that I have come out with now, because that's the fifth cycle, that's the mental field, and it works in dissimilar ways to the opposition. The majority of the human population on our planet under the enslavement template, that's part of the fourth cycle. Okay, so the fifth cycle, that's where you have the imprisonment templates. Why did the imprisonment templates happen? Well, first and foremost, because the 511 pillar were tied up to highly artificial constructed realities. It was tied into the civilizations that undergone a strong degree of inversion and created what we call dark light structure. That then led to the implosion and the collapse of many of the Sirian systems, that's Sirius B, that then chose to coexist and continue their existence either in stasis as part of androids. They created an artificial fifth to continue their attempt to get back into physical forms. Many of the ones that got caught up in the explosion of an implosion of our fifth planet, which many have referred to in different variations and names and whatnot. I'm just saying the fifth planet of our system, which was not a fifth planet, it was a fifth dimensional reality field that is now the asteroid belt. Because it completely, whatever was left, materialized into these little, not little, but the asteroid belt. Don't ask the dynamics with that. Just go with this because science cannot explain it. And for me to begin to explain how fifth dimensional then descend into becoming dust is, as I just said, that's part of the laws and the dynamics of the reality fields. What was then left was the original fourth dimension, which were tied to the fourth cycle, which were tied to our planet and Mars. And the continuation of these projects continued. On Mars, we had the D10 collective. On our planet, it was under the supervision of the Sirian A and Pleiadian groups. And under council structure, under the 410 original pillar project, under organization, as it also was on Mars to begin with. But riots happened, scavengers happened. The Raptoids, as part of the D10 collective, decided to do otherwise. They decided to align with the Orion collective on the D8, and wars broke out, and things got wrong, and then we lost the ability to the fourth dimension. Then an artificial fourth dimension was created around our planet to house the migrants from the fifth planet and the fourth planet. So we are now having the foundation of the artificial reality fields around our planet, which wasn't there to begin with. Let me put it this way, we had our own fourth dimension and our own fifth dimension, but that were a dormant state because the project we had on our planet was a 3-9, so that was technically the lab of the Pleiadians to grow what we call forms within the 3 dimensions, as in to undo the effects of the timeline event as a pre-laboratory state for later organic vessels. Once we lost the fifth planet, kaboom, we lost the 4 in wars, which is now occupied by different groups of the D10 collective. We were then left with the last planet, and that's ours, which were reorganized to be able to house what was left of the other 2 systems in artificial realms around this planet, which became the foundation of the ancient astronauts, which are, as the Hopi Indians talk about, the ant friends, the insectoid beings, and some of the android beings that are here. some of the reptoid beings that are here are also part of that fourth cycle that came from Mars and continued their regression, but were part of the regenesis programs that were instigated on our planet. And in the fifth ring around our planet, unfortunately, the androids grew, the Atlantean project failed, and what came out of that were templates with a high degree of what we call the infection rate of the dark light coding, which technically devoided them of the ability to have any vessel, either android or move around like a shade, which became the foundation of the dark ones or the archons. So now you kind of have that background history summed up. So then we had that whole project going on here for a while. Let me put it this way, the Pleiadian and the Sirian Ace did not do a good job. The fourth cycle project failed. Our own fields began to collapse. The heaviness of the artificial fourth became too much. The ones that were in the artificial fourth from Mars got a little bit disgruntled about the whole project going on here. They wanted new vessels. They didn't want to have the ones that they were given. They regressed even more. They became more territorial. Wars broke out in the fourth dimension, and on and on and on. In the fifth, the programs began to collapse because it was Sirian technology, but as the Sirians themselves got contaminated and got the dark infection rate of the inverted genetics, the cubes began to deteriorate, and that in that way, the dark AI up there took over, and then that's kind of what's around our planet. So with that, the whole, that Sirian Pleiadian project going on here were under strain due to these artificial realities. Our own original fourth began to collapse, which took away the fourth dimension in this world that we have now. And the fifth began to be highly infected, to put it that way, with the dark light coding, and with that putting a quarantine around our little hub here that we call our planet. And that closed us in and isolated us from the rest of whatever was in this quadrant, until some of the D10 collective on Mars figured out how to use some of the old gate systems and entered in here and colonized us. They did so because there were some of the Sirian A's that decided to cahoots and collaborate with the D10 collective because they got the offering of getting in charge of this new reality. The D10 collective would build here under the different structures, as you know, the brotherhoods under the avians, and the elite under the reptoids, and other controllers of some of the other scavenger groups, and on and on and on, which then got an elevated position inside this reality, while the rest were put under enslavement templates, aka were stripped of their fourth dimensional capacities, were locked under prohibiting technologies, all sorts of artificial programs, and technically put into oblivion to run in an Ouroboros merry-go-round of lives on and on and on until we got depleted, while the groups that had come in and colonized us harnessed everything from our upper templates, and we were just here in the three lower fields walking around like little puppets that didn't know any better because we are completely controlled by the prohibiting technologies. That's the enslavement template. So that's where you colonize and you enslave the existing civilization. You take over the entire reality field and turn it in for use for the ones that have colonized it so they can harness the resources. So that's the story about that one. But when it comes to the imprisonment templates, that comes with when the D10 collective took over. They spotted pretty quickly that the fifth dimension was going to be a huge issue, especially the ones that had the faulty genetics from Atlantis and the ones that had the link up to the dark inverted coding. Their templates were technically in such a darkened state that if it ever activated, they would become these Archon overlords inside this reality and pose a problem to the D10 collective or the reptile species that were here, the Dracos that were here, that were fourth cycle beings. So they had issues with their own fifth. They never reached that level. They stayed within the fourth. So their hierarchical structures goes into, there are certain organic ways that they're doing things within the regressive dynamics, which we can always argue. But in that way, the fifth, the technology was not really something that they chose. They are kind of, the reptiles are warriors. They didn't want the technology. They were happy with the good old-fashioned ways. So let's just put it in that context. Some of the insectoids in the fourth cycle as part of our reality field right now are controlled by the fifth cycle. So they were limited within hive mind hierarchical structures and became enslaved and stripped of their possibility to progress up to what we call a different type of organic vessel if they wanted to. And they were linked up to the hierarchy of the dark ones. In that way, the dark ones got an access point through the insectoids and were allowed to work with the insectoids in the fourth, but they were not allowed to be inside this reality. That was an old agreement that was coined or made by the D10 and the D5 that were left on our planet of the original Sirian species. Some of the Sirians were working under the Sirian A group, which is the spiritual teachings, what became the quote-unquote right-hand path. And then some of the Sirian Bs, they decided to work within the more shady nature under the Dark Ones and some of the redemption templates, as they were called, where they were allowed into this physicality, but under strict ruleship of a strict type of life that would, like, you take coal and you push it and push it and push it until it turns into a diamond. So that was under some pretty unpleasant redemption means that meant a lot of suffering. That's where the whole suffering Christ story comes from. The extreme amount of suffering under the redemption templates was supposed to assist these inverted code sequences to return back into light, which of course did not work. The suffering literally just fed it and made it even more dark. So it inverted it even further. And to avoid them they had been granted within specific reality fields, within specific sections of our reality field, and selected cycles inside our reality field. They were granted specific specific organic vessels that would belong to the dark lineages of the Atlantean projects. 3 specific lineages were granted to them, which already were flawed or could carry that genetic structure. They became a specific subspecies, quote unquote, similar to the rest of us, but they carried that redemption template inside this reality field. To avoid the infection rate that came both from Atlantis and some of the things that they did there, as part of also the agreement with the D10 collective, that type of template structure with this seal that were going through the 612 pillar, which the D10 collective completely demolished. But the seals from there prevented what we say the 5th cycle activation process. So that way the Dark One would be in the form, but only work through this reality field, organic vessel, 3 lower fields, as well as the 4th cycle, where the principle of balance and transformation was the key to transform the inverted genetics into progressive genetics again and undo the deeds of the past and the wrong deeds in that way, not as a kind of a punishment, but the Dark Ones eventually felt it was a punishment because they forgot what they did on Atlantis due to the inverted genetics that technically was part of the construct of the 5th cycle technology from the Sirian system to begin with. But as you know from the Souls of Humanity book, it happened in the Sirius system where some of the groups there decided to tamper with the core crystal plasma configuration of the reality field, the holographic network, and contaminated that and drew in energy from previous cycles to try and undo certain effects to assist and help these 3 lineages that were flawed to begin with. So it's a very complex story. But that template eventually, because of the hardship of being under the redemption template, many of the Dark Ones gave up getting into the organic vessels. They gave up this hardship of life and decided that it was easier just to work through the insectoids and then let the insectoids operate inside humans that only had the enslavement. And in that they became these shadow beings that were just overseeing as the archons, the insectoid, the 4th cycle. And with that, were working through different groups within humanity that were prone to less administering of the 5th cycle mental field, which were constructed as part of the transformative template once the 5th cycle and 4th cycle in our solar system collapsed, before we were taken over by the D10 collective, which then took over, re-engineered that and turned it into the mind field and the emotional field on an even lower arch that kept us in oblivion. So this is some of the background, so you have that understanding. But the point being is that the sealing of the 5th cycle template level and consciousness that were inverted in what was called the Dark Ones, that then chose to work through the insectoids and get access to our reality field. Instead of having their own physical vessel here, they were kind of as parasitic entities latching on to an insectoid that were just under the enslavement template. That was later spotted because they began to gain power and they became a huge issue for the people around it in this reality that then had been arranged under the colonization rules and the elite and whatnot. So in that way, they were captured and then they came under what's called imprisonment. You're still in this reality. You still have your insectoid linked to you. You are still operational inside, but we have now blocked you completely so that there is between the fourth and the fifth dimension, there is a blockage that not even the dark ones can circumvent. So in that way, they got trapped in the arrangement that they have made and became part of the rebirth of these human beings that had the enslavement template and were linked to the fourth, but they were captured inside this weird configuration of the hive mind insectoids that were controlled by the cube technology in the fifth, of which the dark ones then became like these pushed out entities that were in the vicinity of the holographic template, but never got allowed inside. And then at the same time sealed off with some of the unfortunate timelines of the 612 that ties into some of the unfortunate past civilizations that have been where the dark ones reigned and messed things up to a degree that is now creating what we call the underworld. So in that way, that's the 2-8 pillar, and that's some of the issues that are lying there with the imprisonment templates. I know this is a lot to swallow, and most people say, "Oh, am I under this? Am I on an imprisonment template? And whatnot? Ooh, am I under redemption? Ooh." And this is the difficulty. And most say, "Oh, Randy, you have to tell me if I'm this or that or whatever." And in that way, it's just, as you do your energy work, whether it's on one or the other, when you do your energy work and your clearing work, it will show you what you are if you're willing and eager to deal with it. Because technically, the current version of who you are is the 3 lower fields that's been recirculated a long time and in a way become its own entity. What is in your template is then kind of a dissimilar entity when we talk about the imprisonment template. It's kind of a whole level of consciousness that's on its own, that is either run by the insectoid that kind of presents itself to be the higher self, which can only get through into you through a Kundalini awakening, which is what they do. And most of the ones who awaken using the Kundalini awakening are releasing some of the dark seals, and then the dark one can begin to integrate and operate through people. That's why they get a lot of information, because what one thing the dark ones have that the insectoids do not have anymore is that the dark ones have the 5th cycle knowledge of all of the rules of cosmos and all the dynamics. They know all of the higher laws of how this world works because they are intact on that level. The downside is it is completely inverted and service to self. So when you see people who have this full awakening and all they go out is becoming the big progenitors of all sorts of programs that harness energy and full of all sorts of things that leads to their growth, but their followers are depleted, then you understand what you're actually dealing with. And all depending on the hierarchy of the dark ones, that depends on the higher up they are, the more they deplete their followers. The more followers they need, the more people they need to harness energy from to continue their existence. Because they're trying to literally create a whole new lineage of humans that they began in the 2000s that will be able to hold that inverted dark light coding, but under a crystalline structure, that's the crystalline Syrian bees, that enables them to isolate and insulate the inverted coding. And then they have what we call, in the core, you have the dark light coding, but surrounding it, you have the original, what we call 4th cycle coding. So they are what we call sheep's in lamb's clothing, because everything about them appears to be benevolent and kind and under all of the ruleships of what we understand as spiritual awakening and working towards a better world and doing all the spiritual teachings in the best way possible. But when it begins to climb through the fourth cycle and get closer and closer to the fifth, that's where you begin to see this structure begins to collapse, because that's where the dark one gets closer and closer. And by that, the entire energy system holds less and less of the fourth cycle progression dynamics and more of the fifth cycle inversion. And that's where we see many of the gurus and many of the ones that reaches that level, they certainly shift, they turn into something else. And before you know of it, it's no longer this kind, inclusive guru type. Then it becomes some kind of weird teacher that tells people weird stuff that ends out not good for anyone. So that's where that one flips you. And we will see more of that as we get through the 2-8 pillar. That will become more clear for many people where these, because they have succeeded in the 2000s and prior to that to create specific tracks inside the main timeline where they now are in human form. And that's one of the reasons why some things are going the way that they're going in our world, because they're getting stronger inside this reality field, unfortunately. And with AI, we have now completely opened the door. So in that way, it's no longer a possibility. It has come to that point where it has passed the probability and are beginning to go into manifestation. And once it's there, it just has to play out. It just has to play out its content. It just has to play out what is under the law of the cycles. So with that understanding, the imprisonment template are often associated with the military projects under what's left of the Atlantean oversight of the fifth cycle remaining groups, of which most of them are what we call the Dark Ones or the Archons, or under some type of old priesthood, whether it's in Egypt or it's in Atlantis or wherever it is, people who go into these inflated states where they think there used to be a high priestess or a high priest or whatever in Atlantis. That is typically one of the fifth cycle templates that most likely, I'm not saying it is, but most likely is under the Syrian B crystalline project, trying to undo the invertedness by giving specific narratives and specific programs that assist people in this inflated state where they are special, not humble, but special. That means that they feel they have a mission in teaching others. Not that I am, but I'm not teaching you per se, but you could say, oh, you're teaching, you're sharing your information. Yes, that's the fifth cycle trait as well, because the fifth cycle trait goes under 5 different hats. One, the judge, which doesn't mean a judge as in I'm ruling over you or whatever, but that is to monitor and see the prospective future of a specific timeline and what that will lead to, and then make the choice as part of the council, as part of an advisory setup to what would be the best choice to take within the possibility rate, so that the probability of that prospective future will not come to be, so that the manifestation that will come within that specific timeline will still be for the highest good of the many under the principles. So that is to make the most optimal choice, of which most will progress and get elevated and undergo the regenesis. That's a quote-unquote judge in the fifth dimension. And that was turned into the invertedness. So that was the first tier. Then there was the healer, as in doing the regenesis, understanding how to do the horizontal merging to assist and heal and learn the vibrational state of the other, as in aligning using the interference patterns, which we can call within the frequency sciences, to elevate the other person, not by doing it for them, but by being them, coexisting with them, and assisting them in creating the regulated field that allowed them to tap into the holographic teaching system from where they could gain the knowledge and the insights themselves, so that we created that field and that knowledge and that science, so that they understood what they were to do by literally holding the field for them, not doing the work for them, but holding the field for them so that they could do the work. That's the original healer regenesis, horizontal merging programs that were supposed to be that were changed into, as in the blind leading the blind inside this reality. Then there is the sciences that goes with the 511 pillar, that goes into understand all the reality dynamics, the cycles, and with that come up the sciences, the architecture, the framework that is necessary to build the structure of different reality fields, from where the judges and the healers can then operate in the understanding of the full sciences of what they need to do to ensure under the healer that the elevation processes will be fulfilled, within the judge processes that the elevation processes will be honored in the right manner, in the right way, for the highest good of the many. And then there's the teacher. And the teacher is not a teacher, but that's the best way to understand it. And that's where those who experience the first on the path, the first of many, they share their experiences with others, so others have a frame of reference of what it means individually, how relative reality dynamics work, how this is unfolded as a personalized structure that then leads to the full complex understanding of, okay, I actually have an example in front of me, and that person is then my role model. That was twisted later into the guru, where then the guru knows it all and then says very little, and then the followers have to figure out things as they move along. So it's a mentoring role model, exhibiting the features that are necessary. All of that ties up to a specific configuration within the fifth cycle that leads to the full understanding of all of these different principles of how to actually navigate with a full sovereign fifth dimensional template, the advanced reality construction, archetypes and architectures and holographic templates and technologies that leads to the support of the true sciences of an advanced civilization, whereas the 410 leads to the true sciences of progressive dynamics, of how to govern a civilization, of how to coexist as peaceful species that are working together, enabling the growth potential of all for the highest good of the many. But there were also what we call the guardians, and they are later what become the warriors, because as the D10 collective invaded our solar system and the wars that were going on Mars, the guardians, quote unquote, the ones that were holding up the barriers of and kept the memories of some of the previous cycles and what were going on there, the buffer of to ensure that a segregation would remain and protecting the program itself would then defend the program in a manner of being able to transform the incoming energies, spot the incoming energies from a fifth dimensional level, going into the sixth dimension, where that buffer feature would be the full understanding of literally like a full-blown omniscient personality structure that would monitor all timelines, all levels of reality, and all the time make sure that all things that were played out would then lead into the highest progressive dynamics of all involved, monitoring the entire system as part of its existing collaborating with the original AI constructions, let's call that, the augmented cube technology, as well as the councils as an advisor, and on, a very, very complex level of the 612 pillar. But there were also warriors that kind of grew out of that then were sucked into the fourth cycle issues that were part of Mars. And we have a lot of warrior templates from the wars on Mars. We have a lot of warrior templates from the Pleiadian system. There are all Pleiadian warriors. As that system fell, they turned into scientists and warrior templates. And that to survive, some of them came here as scientists and warriors and had the double capacity to be both. And they came under the enslavement templates. And all of this has ended up in this weird mix that we are in right now. So that's the way that I can put this difference between the enslavement template and the imprisonment template. And I know it sucks when people discover that they are under the imprisonment template, and I tried. I did my very best in Australia. I have been trying the very best I could ever since. I have been presented with different people where I've done everything that is humanly possible. But the downside is that the inversion rate in most of these people are so high that the moment they reach the fifth dimension, there's in the fifth and the sixth and the seventh and the eighth dimension, there's nothing but the dark light coding. And that these code sequences are much, much stronger than the fourth cycle under the regressive genetics enslavement template. So in that way, as we also know as a psychotherapist, when we're dealing with people who have severe childhood trauma, if they are functional and administering well and they have a life that is honorable and in a way is suitable for what they can unfold due to the childhood trauma, and they're not in contact with it, so they're kind of blocked from it, and with that actually have meaningful lives. There is no need to poke hole in that and begin to dig into the childhood trauma if the severity of the trauma is to such a degree that it is technically, it can be mended to some degree, but the cost of that will be higher than just keeping them in the state they are currently in, where they're now living lives that are good enough lives. And the same with the infected templates. Sometimes it's better to just step back and don't poke the bear. Because what comes there, what's behind there, some of the very high-leveled priestesses and priests of Atlantis were a very selected group, a very specific group that in contact with them, you fully understand what it means, what evil truly is, including some of their underworld stuff where you can also connect to that as part of the 2-8 pillar. I'm not advising this, but that's where we begin to understand how these vibrational and radiation states work. And the underworld is only vibration. So that affects our vibrational field and our emotions. And if we clear that out, we get less susceptible for an inversion, so to speak, or an inclusion, as I call it, from some of the underworld entities. But when we talk about the radiation field and the 5th cycle, that's in the logic mind field. That's where you have the cold psychopathic mind. And that is, as far as we know, not really healable. You can't really change that structure, and that's part of the infection. The dark light coding doesn't want to be changed. It wants to remain as it is, but it wants more energy so it can continue to exist. That's where we get the gaslighting. That's where we get the psychopath. That's where we get the narcissist. That's where we get, the narcissist is more underworld kind of infused, but there are traits of that. The service to self, we could call that an extreme form of narcissism. So it's a very specific structure, and we will see more of these people in the future. There are more of them in high positions, as we know, and that's because they have these templates. So in that understanding, there are certain things that can, once it's bled through and become part of the human field, there's not much we can do. Once it's still isolated as part of the 5th dimension, it is only the 4th cycle that is being going through, and people are navigating through that and doing the best they can of just being good people in general. Don't poke the bear. Just step back and say, that's it. That's not for you to unravel unless it activates on its own. Then you have to deal with it, of course. And that's typically where people are activated within what we call the dark awakening. But the dark awakening can also be a part of the enslavement template, because some of the ones that got enslaved, they had war trauma from the Pleiadian system and the Orion system, or war trauma from the Sirian system, or war trauma from Mars. So awakening into that is also technically a very traumatic awakening process. That's what I'm trying to say here. There are no simple answers in this. That's why our psychological foundation must be in order before we begin to activate our higher order template. That we can work with. That is important for us to work with. And that's where I began 10 years ago. That was my original intent, where I wanted to work with people on the psychological level, so you build the resilience and the strength and the sovereignty within your current human form, so you know whatever comes, you will, even though how immersed you are in it, you will still know, I'll get through this. It might take time, but I will get through this, because you have the reliance on your knowledge of, you have gone through so many other things. You come out on the other end and you have learned through it. You have developed yourself through it. You have transformed yourself through it. Sometimes we walk with raised forehead, so to speak, with pride, and we're not that that's a good thing, but with the honorable warrior, I got through this the best way I could. Other times we crawl out completely demolished by the event itself. Trust me, that done that plenty of times. And then we heal up, and it takes months and months and months. And once we healed up, at least we know, okay, I got through the battlefield there. It's no longer part of my trajectory. I got that pattern. But we know we have a vulnerability there because the foundation of these patterns, the root of this is either within the inverted genetics, the dark code. Once it's in our field, it's difficult to get rid of. Hence the quarantine zone around because we are literally affecting everything around us on the radiation field. So that's the mindfulness, the meditation, the transformation, the understanding to monitor our thoughts and schemes and narratives and create the right ones that leads to eventually the brain is only switched on when it needs to process issues that leads to solutions. And when the solution is there, we just switch it back off and just do the downloads and the insights and the higher order perspectives, where we then learn to work through the principles of making the right choices so we don't end up in the inverted service to self orientation. And then the vibrational field, that's much more difficult to handle because that's the heart field, that's our emotions, and that's how we are affected by energies, especially as females, and on and on and on and on, where males have a less strong emotional field in that way because it's not trained in the same degree, and it doesn't have the field merging like females have because we are engineered to produce offspring and take care of that offspring. Men are definitely capable of taking care of offspring via the oxytocin, but they don't have the field. That's why they're less susceptible for emotional triggers. That's why they're more mental and more bodily. And in terms of the fifth cycle, that's not a good thing. In terms of the fourth cycle, that makes them navigate more, less turmoil through the fourth cycle. But they still have to learn to do compassion and teamwork and work together and not just follow the inclination of the mind that would love to just do it my way, like Sinatra used to say. So that there are different, that's why I made the Path of Liberation, where I point out these differences due to the different engineering of our emotional mental fields. So I explained that in the Path of Liberation courses. Because most of the spiritual teaching systems are aimed at males because they have a stronger mental field that easily get tied into the fifth cycle issues that were never resolved. And that's some of the things we're seeing playing out in the world now as well with technology and where technology is being used and some of all of the dynamics that are playing out through the majority of the male physical vessels. There are females that participate, but when we look at that female, we can discuss whether or not the soul actually is female or is part of an old humanoid type of male orientation. Okay, so now you have a little bit of background of some of these dynamics. And even though since I have the sciences and I have the knowledge, unfortunately, as you understood with the healer, nobody can heal this for you. I have been trying to hold the field for people who had that. And the only thing that happened to me was that because of the infection rate and the contamination rate, I quickly turned into something that was not me. So I'm sorry, I'm not strong enough. I don't have that capacity. And I don't even know if anyone has. And that's most likely why civilizations that has a strong degree of that infection, most of their organic vessels are in stasis. What is operating in reality fields are androids to avoid the jumping of the dark light coding because it's highly imprintable and it changes everything. Hence the quarantine. And that's part of the recognition of what is and what should be activated and what should not. What should be worked with and what should not. So that's where I want to go here as we are getting into the 2-8 pillar. That's where we begin to get into the more complex levels of the activation and cleanup processes. And some of the things that will activate, that will create certain challenges for us, which hasn't been there before. Because before we had quite a lot of these templates were just operating through the enslavement insectoid level and were not operating for the fifth dimensional level. And the attempt to activate that, as we've seen in 2017 and on within the military projects, most of them have not gone so well. So they have been shut down for now, which is good, but that's kind of where we have an individual choice. But when we're now entering into the global activation and cleanup cycles, then these templates will begin to activate because that's under the law of the cycles. It must be worked through either to elevate and get out of its current state or to deconstruct and cease to exist. That's the reality field itself that's shedding its timelines that are no longer functional so it can reboot and elevate itself. Not because it's intelligent, but that's because the construct itself is engineered that way. It was only to last as long as the viability rate were over 30%. Once it reached the 30% threshold, then it would go into reset because then there were no more viability rate left to ensure that the degree of prosperous and functional template structures were larger than the dysfunctional. The moment the dysfunctional takes over, the entire system begins to collapse. And again, the main mechanics here is to prevent that collapsing structure to affect the sister system in Andromeda and other places that are tied to our solar system. All right, I know this is a lot to take in, but this is where I now can begin to not just support you psychologically. For those of you who are going through the psychological processes, that's where I suggest we do an individual on a one-on-one. So you do therapy with me and we work our way through this so you get what you need in your relative reality, me than just talking on it on a generic level. And then here for the future humanities, I will give some of the information that is necessary. And as I said in the public one, I'm also creating a specific sign up for a monthly email with an MP3 little message that is generic. It's for all. That gives some of the indication of some of the work that we are to do each month. And then you will have the ability to write me an email question where you can ask, what does that mean to me? Not that I'm looking at you or whatever, but if you have some questions that in a way are personal, but I can't tell you what to do in an email. Of course, you'll have to do a session. But again, that's just psychotherapy. That's not the big progression work, because at this point, due to all the experiences I've had, I'm monitoring my levels of distortion. And I'm trying very hard not to add more to it, because as in my attempt to try and help, because I came from a good place, I damaged my own template. So I need to make some choices here as well, not because I'm survival mode, but because it's just very, very unpleasant. And I don't really see any need for me to go there when it really doesn't lead to anything. It just becomes that I get sucked dry and then I'm left like a little raisin on the floor. So I'm sorry, I have to also protect myself and take care of myself, whatever's left, so that my life that is complex and difficult enough doesn't get more unbearable because I'm trying to help things that technically can't be helped. That's the distorted healer, the wounded healer distortion program. I'm not continuously trying to help when it takes me out. Not because I'm service to self and survival mode. Some would probably claim that. But those of you who've been in this line of work and been trying to help people who doesn't want to work or can't be helped or just have things in them, even though they're good people, what is further up in their field, if that constantly gets at you and it slams you and it haunts you and it pulls you through the mill of horrors you can think of from A to Z, and it leaves you completely traumatized and scattered and destroyed, no matter how kind that person is, no thank you. I'm not strong enough for that. And that's also being humble to know what we can and cannot do. And then in that monthly possibility you can subscribe to, then there will also be a link to unlisted playlist where I will go more into detail with some of these dynamics, which I'm here in September month with this one are opening up for, so that you understand that within that playlist, it will be more like the sciences on the 5th level, knowledge for some of these dynamics, whatever is necessary for me to share. But as again, nobody can do the work for us. We have to do it ourselves. This is part of the original structure. Because if we can only prosper if someone else is carrying us there, then once we'll never get into the true realities, because nobody's helping us there. We will come in like an elephant in a china shop. And they've got good wells. And they have no interest in doing more than what they necessarily have to do to protect themselves, because they have lives too. And we have had plenty of times to undo the effects of whatever was happening in our solar system. And we have not administered that well. And from a human perspective, that's kind of like a nail on the board. We don't like that. But from a higher order scientific point of view, that's the only rational way to go about it. Just think about zombie movies, right? Would you go into a city that is full of zombies thinking that you can change that? Of course not. You would stay away from that and let it run its course until there are no zombies left, or they go dormant, or the reality itself collapses and there are no longer any traces of that type of consciousness. These are the laws of the cycles. So when we come into these very ethical, complex questions where we really, it doesn't feel good, then we revert to the principles and the rules of engagement and the laws of the universal structures. And then we recall on a higher order scientific level what is necessary and what must be done without being service to self, but seeing it for the highest good of the many. And that's the difficult part. But that's what we're here to train. And that's what we're here to learn. And that is part of what it means to be sovereign. All right. So that was a bit of a mouthful here on September 1st, 2025. And that's because it is now, as I said, 9 years ago. We had the same number sequence in 2016, which is interesting because that was also a number 9 at the year. And that means we are now connecting back to that 2016 where the 3-9 pillar activated. And we now have this month a very, very specific opening to redo what we didn't get done back then and get all of that summed up and caught up so that when we go into October, where the 2-8 pillar begins to initiate its processes, we have completed the 3-9 pillar and are now ready to hopefully not engage too heavily with the 2-8 pillar activation or cleanup, and do the bifurcation ourselves and step into the subsidiary timeline. All right, people, take care. I know this is a bit of a mouthful. And be well. Do the best you can. That's all we can do. Bye now.